If we haven't met, my name is Ben Williams. This is my wife, Melissa, and I'm partially saying that so that you will keep telling us your names, even though we should know them by now. We'd like to serve more at this church. I would like to take the role of senior pastor. And this morning, I'm not going to preach a trial sermon, because by my count, I've preached 44 messages here over the last year, not counting last November and December. Instead, we'd like to tell you our story. I like to tell stories, and we like to go on adventures together. I love phrases like, "It was a dark and stormy night," "Once upon a time," and of course, "A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away." A couple things you need to know about me is I've studied the Old Testament, and we also have 5 children. For me, that is partly because that is great story material. That creates good material for preaching. But today you're going to hear parts of our story. And these are all about God being faithful and us trying to follow. He's the hero. He's always been faithful, and we are trying our best to follow. But Melissa and I met at church camp. And we came to that camp from 2 different churches that were opposite sides of a church split. My dad became the preacher at one side of that split, and Melissa's parents were faithful leaders on the other side of that split. We were both raised by conservative Christian parents. And when we were in middle school, the 2 preachers, even though they didn't always get along, decided that it was a bad idea for Christ's church to be divided. And so they reunited that church that had been split. So in middle school, we got thrown into the youth group together, and she thought I was a nerd.
Yeah, I still do. So I teach middle school now, and Ben at that time was a typical middle school boy, loud, sometimes annoying, but also he was smarter than any person that I knew at that age too. And even at that young age, he had a deep love of Bible knowledge and of sharing Jesus with others. Today, he's usually less annoying to me. But I also know that his greatest desire is to handle God's word with care. And I also know that an even bigger desire is to disciple others to become greater followers of Jesus. That's his passion. So the nerd turned into a perpetual student, and by perpetual, I mean perpetual, that loves to teach others about the Bible. So in high school, I was best friends with one of Ben's older sisters, and she was a couple years older than me. And when that sister left for college, Ben decided to swoop in, and he became my best friend. And I wasn't allowed to date till I was 16, so Ben planned our first date for my 16th birthday, and it went something like this. "Do you have any plans for your birthday?" "No, not really." "Good, don't make any." Sweet. And the rest, as they say, is history.
We were married just after her freshman year of Bible college, and yes, we were very young. And I always wanted to be a preacher, so while we were first married in Bible college, I took a job preaching at a church while doing college full-time and working another job. And then we graduated, and we went on to serve a small church in Indiana, actually a larger church in Indiana. So by 23, we thought we had it all. We had a son, we purchased a house, I was the preaching minister at a growing church, and Melissa at that point decided to be a stay-at-home mom, and we had preschoolers in our home as she was providing childcare. And these are some pretty great kids, and some of them had been recently adopted. And you will notice a theme throughout our life of preschoolers and college students being in our home a lot. So we thought we had it together, and we had a plan. It was my goal to preach at this church for 20 years. I had a fancy master's degree in church growth, and I was ready to lead them through growth and building projects. And don't laugh at me. Okay, we can laugh now. And I planned that someday, towards the end of that 20-year mark, that I'd pursue some more education in Bible. And by the age of 50, I'd be able to retire from preaching and start a professor role full-time.
He turned 50 last week, by the way.
Is that applause for survival?
So Ben had that plan, which was our plan, but I also had a plan. I wanted to support Ben in ministry. Ministry had always been a part of our relationship, and serving the church had always been, and I wanted to continue doing that. I wanted to use my teaching degree, but more than anything, I wanted to be a mom. Even when I was little, and you asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would always say from the time I was little, I want to be a teacher and I want to be a mom. And I had a plan for how that was going to work, and I had it timed out perfectly, and I knew that we were going to have at least 4 kids, and I knew exactly how far apart I want them spaced, and it was all going to be perfect, and I had a plan, and I knew it was going to work. But so with Ben's preaching position that he got, right after college, and we were able to buy a house, and we had our first baby 9 days after I graduated from college. The plan was going just how we wanted it. We were so good at creating plans. But then the perfect plan started to unravel. And things would happen, and the children would not come anywhere near to how I had planned.
My part of the dream died when that church fired me because I was 26 and I was too driven. Didn't have anything to do with immorality or even bad theology in my preaching. But we were in our 20s, and I thought I knew everything, and I made a lot of mistakes with people. There were some influential people in that church who loved Jesus but didn't particularly like me, and so we parted ways. In 2001, our perfect plan and our dream began to crumble around us. And at the same time that the church fired me, Melissa experienced several miscarriages, and we went into a season of secondary infertility that would last us for 8 years. We would not go where we thought on this journey, and that was the beginning of us following instead where God would lead. So I took a job in a factory while I was applying at other churches. And during that period, we found a continued theme of the churches didn't like the fact that we wanted to focus on evangelism. We wanted to focus on pointing people in the community to Jesus more than making people in the church happy where they were and what they were doing. So I continued to work at the factory while we continued to pursue ministry. And I learned more about where people in the community were. And that first night on the factory, I worked side by side with a man who had tattooed sleeves, most of which he had given to himself. And he would later come and say to me, "Do you know of any church where I can go where someone won't give me a hard time about my tattoos?" And sadly, at the time, I didn't. But that began to shape the way I did ministry.
And he also gave us some really cool tattoos.
My mother's watching, and I don't think she knows about that.
She does now.
It has been almost 25 years, but... So from there, that really did start to shape the way we did ministry. And instead of taking a job at a church, we began to work in campus ministry. And she was my partner in that, even though she wasn't on staff. That was at Miami University in Ohio. And what that means is we were missionaries on that campus. And at that time, the students weren't just at the campus house, they were also in our house. Melissa liked to say that she never knew who she was going to find sleeping on our couch in the morning. We had preschoolers in our house during the day, and we had college students in our house at night. And I started to learn how to relate to people, especially young people, by meeting them where they were. When we went to a state university, we decided things like we were going to be available to the students who were drinking too much. And where they were, we were going to point them to Jesus. We really didn't know what we were doing, but some of those drunks became followers of Jesus.
During our time in campus ministry, I began to learn about some of the issues that women face. And I began to hear stories. And I won't share those stories, but now I still mentor college girls, and when I tell them that I've heard it all and nothing will shock me and don't be embarrassed, it's because of the years that I spent working at Miami University with college girls specifically. Each time that they would come to me or Ben would call and say, "I have a girl in my office who just needs a mom hug," I would feel unworthy and not equipped to handle the issues because I wasn't. During our 5 years of campus ministry, each time I would hold a young woman as she cried or she said, "There's no way God can love me," and I would say, "You are loved and you are valuable," I would look at Ben later and make the comment that, "Whoa, if God ever gives us girls, I think I will be ready." And then God shook his head and laughed at me because he gave us 5 kids, boys and girls, and I was nowhere near ready. We ended up with 3 girls in our house that were 2 years apart, with only 2 years between them. And so imagine this: 3 years in a row, a girl turned 13. 3 years in a row, a girl turned 16. 3 years in a row, a girl turned 18. And I wasn't ready. But bigger than that is when they're your own kids, you feel a lot of pressure, and you as parents understand that. I wasn't just dealing with a young college girl who in a couple years may not see again. These were my kids, and my greatest desire is to point them to Jesus, and I like to get things right. And so many times I didn't get things right. I think sometimes I did. Sometimes I would say, "Oh, that was a good mom moment," but more often than not, it wasn't. Now those girls are in their 20s, and all of our children are adults, and I'm still figuring it out. And I still have to trust God to fix the mistakes I made, and I can't live in the past of, "Oh, I should have done it that way." Luckily, my kids are full of grace, and I still have to figure out how to give my family to God every single day. But that's really easy for me, partly because I have really great kids, and God has proven himself over the years to be faithful, so when it's hard, I can remind myself of all the ways that he's already been faithful.
During those years, even though our house was full of young people, it felt empty. We went through infertility treatments, we sought out adoption and foster care, and I would just say that during those 8 years, we just kept hitting closed doors. And Melissa would frequently pray, asking God to either take away her desire for more children or to give us more children. And we didn't understand what was going on, but every day I related to Hannah's prayer from the book of 1 Samuel a little better. And I want to give you a couple other notes from that time in campus ministry. The first is that we were broke. I was making $22,000 a year, and some months I didn't get paid because no money came into the mission that month. And during that time, we had 2 mortgages, and I have a major medical condition. But we had made the decision that during even those financial, very lean times, that we would tithe. We would give 10% to the local church. And I can tell you many stories, but one is we gave our tithe at the beginning of the month, and a couple of days later, our furnace quit. And we got the estimate that it would be over $700 to fix it. And that afternoon, a check showed up that was within pennies of the amount we needed. That check was mailed long before our furnace quit. We have many stories of God being faithful like that. The second thing to note is that was not a church, that was a parachurch organization. We love the church, and we constantly pointed our students to the church. In fact, it was our continual motto that students would find a church where they could serve and grow. So during those years, we learned a lot about the local church, but also about the bigger kingdom of God. And during those years, I was still doing some preaching. I was still consulting with churches, and I went back to school and I finished a master's degree in Old Testament. Then I got the call to teach in Bible college in Missouri. This was 20 years ahead of my schedule. I've spent the last 2 decades as a professor of preaching and Old Testament. And during those years, God led us to a very specific form of ministry, and we began adopting children. Now, I'm going to ask something very pointed of you. We have permission to share our children's stories. You do not. Please do not share their stories. Please do not ask them about their stories. We have heard every kind of question about adopted children, and many of them are inappropriate. We get a lot of those because some of our children are Asian and don't look like us. And some of those make us laugh. We get to laugh, but some of those are in fact quite hurtful. So I'm going to ask you not to talk to my children, asking them questions like whether or not they're adopted. They're simply our kids. But when I started teaching at the Bible College in Missouri, Melissa took a teaching position, and we also started traveling on mission trips quite a bit more. Melissa had been to Mexico with me, and while we were in Missouri, we traveled to Poland and we traveled to Taiwan, and both of those have interesting overlaps with people in the Treasure Valley, a place that we had never visited yet. I also went to Africa to visit some former students, and in 2022, our oldest spent 2 months working with Mohi in Kenya, whom we prayed for this morning. But missions is very important because early in our time in Missouri, we met a missionary family that drastically changed our lives.
So yeah, during the 8 years before moving to Missouri, as we said, my prayer was for God to either give me more children or to take away the desire, because it was a deep, dark place to be in. I wanted this so badly and it wasn't working, and it was a lot of heartache and it was a lot of hard, and it was a lot of me honestly missing some of the good of what I had because I so wanted this thing, and it had consumed my life. So we still wanted more children, and it was still hard, and we'd faced many closed doors, but I was starting to learn to deal with what was instead of what wasn't, and to live life in the moment right then. So shortly after moving to Missouri in 2006, we met a missionary couple that had for over 40 years taken seriously God's instruction to take care of orphans. And they came onto campus for a missions emphasis week that was going on, and we had the opportunity to speak with them. And we talked with them about our story and about where we were and about our desires. And they said one simple phrase to us that would change the course of our life: send us an application. So we did, and I tried not to put too much hope into it because my heart had been broken so many times. So we filled out the application, but I was still in the place that's great. It's just another piece of paperwork. This isn't going to work out. Nothing has worked out. So I'm just going to do it and send it in, but I'm not going to get my hopes up.
And one of the lessons we learned during that process is that we need help. We are extremely independent people and are kind of resistant to other people helping us. But some of those couples that we knew who had adopted children invited us into their circle and became a support group for us, and we simply would not have survived without them. But during those months, while we were doing paperwork, Melissa got sick, and as had happened many times in our marriage, she was hospitalized. And we had been discussing a medical procedure for a number of years. It promised to help with some of her health issues, but it would prevent us from having more children naturally. I know it had been 8 years, and we had little hope, but that's different from medically preventing the possibility. So that night we discussed it, and we prayed about it together, and Melissa was at peace about it for the first time. We gave up, and we trusted God. And I won't go into all the details, but that night something was broken in the house, and after her being hospitalized and everything that was going on, I reached a point of monumental exhaustion where I could no longer physically stand up, but there was still things to be done. So leaning on a counter, I prayed, and I said things like, God, what is going on? I know you are great big. Couldn't you just fix this so I can go to bed? And within minutes, in the middle of the night, the phone rang, and it was a call from Taiwan telling us they had 2 little girls that needed adopted.
God does not promise us that everything will work out the way we want it at all. Throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, there are examples of this is what happened, or perhaps, or maybe, and we're really hesitant to blame everything on God. But one of our kids often likes to say that she doesn't believe in coincidences. And that night, we immediately began to see how God's hands had been at work. See, we'd been wanting this bigger family for 8 years, and we'd been praying about a child and doing everything in our power to get a child. And I find it no coincidence that the night that I specifically finally gave everything up and gave up my control to God, and I agreed to a medical procedure that I'd been fighting, we got a call. And the call was not about one child, it was about two. And had we not had things going on at home, had not all of these things happened, it was the middle of the night. Ben would have been asleep. They sent me home from the hospital with painkillers, so I was like loopy. And if these things wouldn't have happened, we wouldn't have heard the phone ring. There are so many other places in that story where God works, and I pray that he still gets the glory, because our biggest fear when we share our story with people is people will look and say, oh, look what they did, or oh, they must be so good because look how they followed Jesus. Guys, I could tell you 10 million stories of all the ways that we didn't follow. You're getting a glimpse of the way that we fightingly sometimes did. But God showed up, and the story is about him.
During that process, we were given air miles for the two of us to fly a round trip to Taiwan from someone we had never met before. We owned 2 houses for over 5 years and couldn't figure out why one of them wouldn't sell. It sold the week we needed some major finances to help with this adoption. And both of us, from that date till now, have more than once reached our breaking point. And we had to get there before we really did give everything else over to God. During that time in our life, there were many years of anger and depression and fear and loss. And yes, we had quite a bit of doubt. But on Christmas Eve,
on Christmas Eve 2007, we landed in St. Louis, Missouri, and walked off the plane with our 9-year-old son and carrying 2 little girls who didn't speak English, and we didn't speak Mandarin, so that was fun. But we walked home on Christmas Eve 2007 with 2 more children.
During those years in Missouri, I also preached at many churches. In fact, I totaled it up. There are a lot of churches in the Midwest, and at one point, I had preached at over 100 of them. But 3 of them I actually served long term, and I consulted with the leadership, and I helped them in the process of hiring a new senior minister. But towards the end of that time, I finished a doctorate in church leadership, and we decided to drive to Alaska.
Because, why wouldn't you drive to Alaska?
It's there, and so we decided to drive there. So we packed up our 3 kids at the time and our dog and a month's worth of groceries, and we were in a 10-year-old SUV that had almost 200,000 miles on it.
We were still really poor.
We were pulling a camper that was over 25 years old that had mostly been remodeled. That's a whole nother set of stories of a 9,000-mile road trip. But on that trip, we also worked at another week of church camp, and we met some people from Boise Bible College. That was in July of 2013. We returned from that trip, and my dad died 3 weeks later, and there were some changes going on in the college at Missouri, and we were feeling restless and somewhat unsettled, but could not tell you why. I cannot always explain how God speaks. Hebrews chapter 1 says that in the old days, God spoke many times in many ways through the prophets, and more recently, he has spoken through his son. If we want to be led, we have to be listening to his son. In December of 2013, after a trip where we went to the International Conference on Missions, Melissa sent me this text that I'm going to read verbatim. This verse popped up in several places for me today. My journal, my Devo book, in the kids' Bible class at work. Hebrews 11:8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. I don't know what that means, but I found it interesting. I think God may be moving us.
So then a couple days later, I pulled out an old Bible that I hadn't used for a while, and a note card fell out of it from a much previous time in our life, and that same verse was written on it. Now, we didn't know if God was speaking or leading, but we decided to be open because early in our marriage, we had agreed that we would walk through open doors until God closed them.
So we were open. Now, I know enough about exegesis and hermeneutics and Bible study to know that that phrase was spoken to Abraham. It wasn't spoken to me. but maybe God calls us to something similar. I also know enough to listen when my wife has been praying. Now, you should learn a couple lessons from our story. The first is that we are wrong a lot, and we're skipping a lot of material so you can get to lunch today. But the second lesson is like it. God likes to laugh at our plans. That's not a general statement, that's a very specific statement for the two of us. And we've learned that when God does that, to hang on for the ride. So in April of 2014, I get a message from a friend whom I had met in Alaska, and it simply said, "There may be a preaching position open at Boise Bible College. You should apply."
And while I say, okay, we'll be open and see, my openness to moving across the country to a state I'd never been to was a little reluctant. And that offer led to a lot of turmoil and prayer on my part. See, because I had a teaching job in Missouri that I loved. I had a group of friends that are still my dear friends today that I would meet with and pray with, and we would raise our kids together, and we did life. Our kids were settled and comfortable. We had a great church. Our house that we lived in Missouri was really small, but we had 150 acres of land and woods for the kids to run and play in, and the girls would get lost frequently. Not always my best parenting moments. Moving really didn't make a lot of sense for us. My parents had moved from Ohio to Missouri to be close to us and help with the kids. So it really didn't make sense to uproot and move across the country to a state where we'd never been to when Ben had a good job and when I had a good job. It didn't make sense. But I did agree to pray about it.
On Wednesday, April 23rd, 2014, I received the following text from Melissa. "I decided I love you again, and I'll follow you wherever you want to take us this time." And then she kicked me out. 3 weeks later, she kicked me out and told me to go in the woods, which is fine because I like to be alone in the woods, especially when I need to make decisions. So I went to a rustic cabin in a state park, and I brought my Bible and a notebook and 2 questions. I had been challenged to count the cost, so I wanted to look at what that meant, and I had been challenged to see what it would cost my family. And so I have better biblical interpretation than that. I know that I'm not going to open my Bible and it's going to tell me whether or not to move to Boise, Idaho. However, that morning, on May 17th, 2014, I was on a trail in Mark Twain State Park in Missouri, and I read Luke 14 because it was next in my daily Bible reading. And Luke 14 includes these words: "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." And Jesus says in verse 25 that applies to everyone who follows him. Leon Morris said it this way: "Devotion to Christ cannot be less than wholehearted. Discipleship is not periodic volunteer work on one's own terms at one's convenience. Bearing a cross is a call of total commitment, and following Jesus will cost you your life. That may not mean an early death, but that means a life of total commitment. And I was ordained to be a preacher of the gospel in 1997, and I want to be faithful to that call."
So exactly 2 months later, we pulled onto the campus of Boise Bible College. We didn't have a house. We hadn't even looked at houses yet. We moved into the dorms. We'd sold most of what we owned, and there were 5 of us at the time and what would fit into a 17-foot U-Haul.
The cost is everything. And our story is not about us. It's not our story because it's not really our life. God is faithful, and we are trying to follow. That was 10 years ago. Through adoptions, through ministry, through moves, and a lot of pieces that you don't have time to hear about today, God has always been faithful, and we are trying to follow. And we thought moving across the country was an adventure, that it was a leap of faith, and it was. And we moved to Boise. At about that time, we watched a young man get ordained into ministry. And at the end of that service, I looked at Melissa and I said, he's 23. They haven't been married very long. They've got a brand new baby and a brand new house, and they're being ordained into ministry. I pray that their path is smoother than ours. And my boss, Chuck Faber, was sitting right in front of me and heard me say that. And he turned around and he said, I have never met two people that swim upstream more intentionally than the two of you. And he was right, and we kept swimming upstream.
So like Ben said, we thought that packing up and moving across the country would be our biggest adventure of the last decade, but it wasn't. God made it clear that he had bigger plans, and that may be the purpose for why we moved. I don't know. When we were trying to buy a house right after we moved here, I fell in love with a house that was clear across the other side of the valley. And I did everything I could, offering and going back and forth and trying to make it work. I wanted this house, and I was going to get the sellers to agree, and I was going to make this work. And there really wasn't, there's still to this day, there's no logical reason why that house fell through and we had to go somewhere else. There's no logical reason at all for that. But we ended up buying a house where we currently live now in Star. And 1 year after moving into that house, we also added 2 more kids. So there's like kind of a theme that we've seen of move to a new house, get 2 more kids. So I told Ben we're not moving anymore. If we would have bought that original house that I had to have, and we continued to fight, we would not have 2 of our kids. So here's that. In May of 2015, a year after we'd lived here about a year, I found out about 2 kids who needed a place to live. And later that day, I had told Ben about what had happened. And Ben's response was, well, they need parents. We can be parents, maybe not good parents, but we can be parents. But me, who can sometimes overthink things, and sometimes I take longer to warm up to ideas, I wasn't so sure. Ben asked me what I was going to do with this information, and my response verbatim was to him, nothing. I'm not going to do anything with this information. I'm not even going to pray about it. And that was partly due to my fear and my lack of confidence in my parenting abilities. But I was like, no, I'm not praying about it. We don't even have room for 5 kids. And Ben's only reply was, let me know how that not praying thing works out for you. So over the next few weeks, I did what I said. I didn't pray about it. And I ignored God, and I ignored anything that might be telling me that we needed to do this. But God. The details don't matter. But a few weeks later, something happened, and there might as well have been an angel. Literally, I can't explain it. There might as well have been an angel standing on our doorstep saying, no, these are your kids. And I knew that I needed to follow God down an uncertain path that may not end the way I wanted it to. And I looked at Ben, and I said, I'm walking down the block to the neighbor's house. And smart aleck that he is, but also knowing me and my heart and my love for kids, he looked at me, and the only thing he said was, okay, let me know when to start moving all the bedrooms around.
Now, the rest of that story is one of those bedrooms was being occupied by a college student. So I had to kick him out to make room for these other kids. And that college student is a missionary that is being supported by this church, and you'll get to hear more from him when he visits in April.
So a month later, after I walked down the street, we were having a home study completed. And a month after that, 2 more kids moved into our house. And in what was honestly probably a really fast adoption process, but it still felt like forever, 1 year later after that, the adoption was final, and we were officially Williams, party of 7. Many people, I just want to take a moment and just to be real and honest with you. So there are a lot of people who are tempted to say things to adoptive families like, you are so amazing for doing that, or even worse, to adopted kids. And it's not just ours. I've talked a lot to families. They say to the kids, you're so lucky that this happened and that you got them as parents. And I get that from the outside, it can look lucky or like amazing, but I need you all to remember that adoption, while it unites families, it doesn't come without a great deal of loss and trauma and pain, not just for the kids, but for the parents and everyone involved. I like to use the word and. I really have come to like that word. So adoption is beautiful and messy. It's laughter and tears. It's joy and sorrow, and they can intertwine together. See, we can't even imagine our life without any of our 5 children. Like we seriously don't even remember what life was like before having 5 kids. Good, bad, ugly, beautiful, and everything in between. And our kids and their significant others, and now our grandkids, one of whom you see often after this service running laps like a racetrack around here, that plan, they bring so much joy. It's messy, it's loud, it's really, really loud. But God's plan for putting together our family is so much better than the plan that 20-year-old concocted. So we've had dreams die, and our kids have had dreams die, but God is able to work in the midst of that. And we are not perfect, and our kids would be the first to tell you that, but we desire to be faithful and follow. And sometimes we do that better than others.
A few weeks ago, I read from Isaiah 61 about the promised one who comes to bring comfort, who preaches good news to the poor. But that same passage tells us that when Jesus fulfills that prophecy, he brings beauty from ashes. And that's what we see as the ministry of the church. Melissa and I are educated people. She also has a master's degree in education. But we don't have very many answers or formulas. Sin is a black and white issue. Almost nothing else is. For our kids, they've all graduated high school, but that has come through public school and homeschooling and online schooling and just about anything else you can think of as we tried to make this work. Melissa's a teacher in the public school system. We believe that there are fewer right answers on such issues and more good choices in the process. Anything that will point our kids to Jesus. And we believe the same thing about the church. There are very few right and wrong when it comes to programming, but there are good choices and there are other good choices. And in this process of adoption and ministry, we just trust a God who's bigger. This is how he worked in our story. We don't know how it's all going to work, but we think that serving this church is the next step and the next adventure.
So that brings us here to today. So we've been attending Canyon Springs for a while Ben has been the fill-in guy for the past year. When Ben first told me that he was taking a 3-month, and I knew it wasn't going to be 3 months, I've done this for a while, interim gig, I agreed to it, but I'm just going to be honest with y'all, I wasn't overly excited. I liked the church that we were going to. I was involved there. I had a small group there. I was leading a high school girls group. And so I was like, okay, go preach at this church for 3 months. We'll see what happens. But after about 5 months of being here, y'all grew on me. And I realized that the thought of leaving and going back to our old church really made me sad. And it made Ben sad too. And so at that time, in April of this year, I started praying, unbeknownst to Ben. And I just had been praying for several months then that God would make it abundantly clear whether we were supposed to stay or leave. And just a few weeks ago, when we found out that this church was still going to need a senior pastor, Ben and I went out to dinner so we could discuss how that might impact us. And I told Ben, for the first time, what I had been praying. And his response in this exact tone of voice was, "What have you done now?"
So that's a little glimpse into our lives. There are a lot more stories, and no, I'm not going to write a book, There's plenty of material there of what God has done, but I'm a little busy trying to share God's word with the local church. Maybe someday Melissa will write the book. I hope that she does. And I do need to tell you that you are not going to get to hear from Melissa nearly as much as you have for the past couple of weeks because she's not being hired on staff, but she is my partner in ministry. Many parts of our story have been hard. It's all been an adventure. God has been faithful, and we want to be faithful in serving him. We love each other, and we love the church. We want to do ministry together with you because we can't do it on our own. We've been praying. We think this is our next adventure. And when it comes to counting the cost, it is not small. I'm stepping back from a 20-year teaching career. And those kind of moves need to become way more normal in the church. Becoming part-time at the college will not be easy for me, but we want to do more with you. All my life, I have based ministry on this verse, Colossians chapter 1, verse 28. Him we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone with all wisdom, that we may present everyone mature in Christ. I want to proclaim Jesus. Not Ben. But my motto for ministry is simple. I want to push everyone I meet one step closer to looking like Christ. So this story is not about us. It's about God. But I think God has a great adventure in store for you as well. Will you follow? Will you get out of the boat? Will you go where he called, even if it is to some place crazy? Will you take a leap of faith, even if there's no net? Will you go where he leads instead of whining about how your plans aren't working out? Would you pray with us? God, you are always good, and today we celebrate the fact that you are faithful. You always do what you say you're going to do. When you call, you worry about the details, even if we don't understand them. Would you help each of us learn what it means to follow you completely and trust you for those details? In Jesus' name, amen.